In June 1984, a 29-year-old U.S. Navy intelligence analyst sat down for lunch at the Hilton Hotel in Washington, D.C., across from an Israeli Air Force colonel. Jonathan Pollard was giddy. This was his first contact with Israeli intelligence. Over the next 18 months, Pollard smuggled more than 1 million pages of classified material, stuffing them into briefcases and suitcases, delivering them to his Israeli handlers in broad daylight. No one in American history had ever stolen so much so fast. Pollard thought he was untouchable, but he was disastrously wrong. This is the story of how a brazen Stanford grad betrayed his country and how he finally got caught. As a teenager, Pollard's loyalty to Israel ran deep. His father, Dr. Morris Pollard, was a renowned microbiologist who often took the family on trips overseas. On one of them, they visited the Dachau concentration camp in Germany, an experience that intensified Jonathan's identification with the Jewish people and the Israeli cause. At Stanford, he began telling classmates he was a Mossad agent, a complete fabrication, one of many lies he'd go on to tell. But when it came to his drug use, he told the truth. He admitted to smoking marijuana about 600 times, enough for the CIA to reject him from its graduate fellowship program. And yet, in 1979, he was hired as an intelligence analyst for the Navy Field Operational Intelligence Office in Maryland, part of the Naval Intelligence Support Center, the central hub of Navy intelligence at the time. When the Navy requested a background check, the CIA, citing privacy laws, failed to disclose that Pollard had been rejected from their own fellowship program. The red flags kept piling up. As recounted in Capturing Jonathan Pollard by former Special Agent Ronald J. Olive, who led the investigation into the case, Pollard began telling supervisors he had contacts with South African intelligence. Relations with South Africa were strained due to apartheid. He claimed his father had once been the CIA station chief at the U.S. Embassy in South Africa. That was a total lie. Still, the man who hired him, Rear Admiral Thomas A. Brooks, believed Pollard wasn't a threat and kept him on. It wasn't until he made a scene at a naval party, rambling to the Director of Naval Intelligence, Rear Admiral Sumner Shapiro, that Shapiro flagged him as unstable and called for his top security clearance to be revoked. To test their suspicions, the Navy staged a ruse, telling Pollard he was being considered as a double agent, which required taking a polygraph. As Ronald J. Olive describes in his book, Pollard acted bizarrely during the polygraph exam. He began shouting and shaking and making gagging sounds as if he were about to vomit. Pollard repeatedly staggered into the bathroom, although he may have had an upset stomach owing to stress. Addison, the agent administering the test, believed that he was faking his sickness. A clinical psychologist who evaluated Pollard concluded that he should not be placed in an operational role and his security clearance should be suspended. He lost his top secret clearance, yet the Navy didn't fire him. According to an internal investigation, the decision to allow Pollard continued access to secret material was based on the fact that while there were serious misgivings about his judgment, it was not clear that he represented a security risk of sufficient degree to warrant termination of all his access to classified information, which for all practical purposes would mean his termination. By September 1980, Pollard's one-year probation had ended, and civil service protections kicked in, making it more difficult to fire him. Pollard fought to get his security clearance back, filing a formal grievance against his commanding officer. And then things started to go his way. In his quarterly performance review, his commanding officer, Captain Chauncey Hoffman, wrote, "Pollard applied himself with great dedication. He routinely works a 10-hour day and at times on weekends." In January 1982, Pollard's top secret clearance was reinstated. A new opportunity soon emerged that gave him a chance to start spying for Israel. In 1983, terrorist bombings in Beirut killed over 300 people, including 241 U.S. service members. In response, the Navy set up a new intelligence hub, the Anti-Terrorist Alert Center. Its mission was to link America's top intelligence commands, the CIA, DIA, NSA, FBI, and more, so they could share threats instantly and prevent a future attack. In May 1984, Jonathan Pollard landed a temporary post there, reviewing classified reports and drafting summaries. By October, he applied for a permanent analyst's job. The review board never saw his history of erratic behavior, drug use, mental health issues, or his disastrous polygraph. None of it was in his file. He got the job as an analyst for the Americas, with access to top secret and sensitive compartmented information. In other words, Pollard now had the keys to some of America's most closely guarded secrets. And he knew exactly which country he wanted to pass secrets to. As a teenager, he had dreamed of immigrating to Israel, but his parents disapproved. Years later, his girlfriend Anne didn't want to move either, so spying for Israel was his way of helping from afar. He justified his actions this way. I watched the threats to Israel's existence grow, and gradually came to the conclusion that I had to do something. In June 1984, Jonathan Pollard met at the Hilton Hotel with Israeli Air Force Colonel Aviam Sella. Pollard had been introduced to Sella through a son of a friend of his father's, a wealthy stockbroker who was impressed by Pollard's intellect and passion for Israel. Pollard and Sella devised a plan to stay in contact using nearby payphones. Sella assigned each payphone a Hebrew letter. Whenever he needed to meet, he'd call Pollard at his home and say the Hebrew letter to direct Pollard to the correct payphone. At their second meeting, also at the Hilton, Pollard arrived with a briefcase filled with highly classified intelligence, including a top-secret study on Saudi Arabian ground forces and satellite images from Israel's 1981 bombing of Iraq's nuclear reactor taken by U.S. reconnaissance satellites. These images were marked top secret because they revealed sensitive satellite positioning data. Pollard began making deliveries every 2 weeks to the Potomac, Maryland home belonging to the Israeli Embassy's scientific attaché, Ilan Ravid, where the documents were photocopied upstairs. When he and his girlfriend Anne flew to Paris to meet Rafi Eitan, the head of Lakim, Israel's scientific intelligence agency, Eitan told him, "You're one of us." Pollard was given a new Israeli identity, Danny Cohen, a name chosen in honor of Eli Cohen, the famed Israeli spy. I produced a video on him linked in the description. The Israelis agreed to pay Pollard $2,500 a month. It wasn't a huge sum to avoid suspicion, but it was enough for him and Anne to indulge in food, drinks, and drugs. Back in the U.S., the operation then moved to the D.C. apartment of Irit Erb, a secretary at the Israeli embassy. Every Friday, Pollard would check out highly classified files and drop them off at Irit Erb's apartment, where she'd photocopy the documents over the weekend. Pollard would return to pick up the documents by Sunday and take them back to the office on Monday. The volume of classified material became so massive that the Israelis eventually bought an apartment in the same building to be used solely for copying. The Israelis were counting on him for the long haul. When Pollard traveled to Israel for the first time under the alias Danny Cohen in the summer of 1985, Spymaster Rafi Eitan laid out a 10-year plan of funneling $30,000 a year into a Swiss bank account held in trust under his alias. The idea of spying for another decade rattled Pollard, especially as the U.S. was rounding up spies in 1985. When he expressed his fears, his new handler, Yosef Yager, a scientific attaché at the Israeli consulate in New York, told him bluntly, as described in Olive's book, "You're obviously not ready for this." But that only made Pollard more determined, and his intelligence had deadly consequences. In October 1985, Israel bombed the Palestine Liberation Organization's headquarters in Tunisia using U.S. satellite imagery Pollard had passed along. At the time, the U.S. was forging a new diplomatic relationship with Tunisia. Tunisia expelled the visiting American delegation, accusing the U.S. of secretly aiding its closest ally in the Middle East. Across the Arab world, American credibility crumbled. It was around this time that a coworker became suspicious when he saw Pollard with a sealed envelope marked "Top Secret, Sensitive Compartmented Information." Pollard claimed he had accidentally checked out the wrong documents and was on his way to destroy them. When an analyst is finished with top secret material, they're usually destroyed rather than stored, with a second person present as a witness. But later, that same colleague saw Anne pick up Pollard from work with the exact same envelope in his hands and drive away. The coworker confided in his wife, who encouraged him to report the incident to his supervisor, Commander Jerry Agee. That Saturday at 6 a.m., Agee went into Pollard's office cubicle where he was shocked to see his desk overflowing with reports on Soviet missile systems and the Middle East, regions he wasn't assigned to. When he requested a 6-month audit of every document Pollard had signed out, he discovered that Pollard picked up documents on Fridays, suggesting he was sneaking material out before the weekend. Agee hesitated. If his suspicions were wrong, it could end his career. He shared his concerns with Lonnie McCullough, Assistant Director of Counterintelligence at the Naval Investigative Service, who agreed that this couldn't be ignored. While the FBI was reluctant to launch a full investigation and dragged its feet, the Naval Investigative Service was eager to move quickly. NIS agents installed surveillance cameras disguised as part of an electrical rewire around Pollard's cubicle. Pollard was caught on hidden camera stuffing an estimated 3,000 pages of classified material into a briefcase in 3 minutes. But no one was watching the feed during those crucial minutes, and the footage wasn't reviewed until months later. When NIS agent Lisa Redmond sat down to interview Pollard, he claimed he was dropping documents off to colleagues. He refused to allow a search of his apartment, saying there might be marijuana inside. His wife used it, he explained, to ease stomach pain. During the interview, he asked to make 2 phone calls to Anne. Both were laced with suspicious language. Go ahead and take Chris the cactus. You know, the cactus we bought for her birthday? He later mentioned something about not forgetting a wedding album. It was all code. Cactus meant Pollard was in trouble. Wedding album was a reminder of the classified documents on China hidden inside their photo album. Anne understood the message. She crammed the documents into a suitcase that weighed over 70 pounds, then handed it off to her next-door neighbors Babak and Christine Esfandiari for safekeeping, explaining her husband was in trouble. But handing it to her neighbors was the worst thing she could have done. Christine Esfandiari's father happened to be a U.S. Navy officer. When his daughter mentioned the strange suitcase stuffed with classified documents, he immediately called the Naval Investigative Service. Agents seized the suitcase and found it packed with classified FBI reports, as well as Anne's fingerprints. When Pollard later agreed to an apartment search, believing Anne had disposed of the evidence, agents discovered about a dozen highly classified documents hidden under the bed and in a closet. When Special Agent Ronald J. Olive, who was leading the investigation, asked Pollard to take a polygraph, he gave a wild answer. "Ron, I don't mind taking a polygraph if they only ask me about the Soviet Union or the Soviet bloc countries." Pollard eventually confessed to stealing classified documents, but claimed he had passed the information to Kurt Lobeck, a freelance war correspondent covering Afghanistan for CBS. He had flashed classified CIA reports in front of Lobeck, but Lobeck repeatedly refused to work with him. Investigators doubted Pollard's story, but they still didn't know who he was really working for. That changed when he made a mad dash for the Israeli embassy in Washington. Out of desperation, he, Anne, and their cat headed for the embassy, with FBI agents trailing them. Pollard hoped his Israeli handler would provide an escape plan. None came. Instead of welcoming them inside, a guard at the embassy told them to leave, apparently unnerved by the FBI presence. Pollard was arrested outside the gates. FBI agents drove Anne and their cat home. Jonathan Pollard was extremely cocky during his interrogation. As Agent Olive explains in his book, Pollard talked down to him as if he were in control of the situation. Now, don't be stupid. Don't stop asking questions just because I won't answer a certain question. You just move on to the next question. He finally admitted to passing documents to Israel, but showed no remorse. Olive observed, "It was as if he were saying, 'I certainly fooled you, you idiots.'" And in one of his more bizarre encounters, he tried to justify his betrayal by saying, "Ron, you know the government shouldn't give high clearances to Jewish people." Both Jonathan and Anne Pollard accepted plea deals to avoid a trial. On June 4, 1986, Pollard pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit espionage. In exchange, prosecutors would not seek a life sentence. However, in the lead-up to sentencing, Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger urged the judge to impose the harshest sentence possible. "It is difficult for me, even in the so-called Year of the Spy, to conceive of a greater harm to national security than that caused by the defendant in view of the breadth, the critical importance to the United States, and the high sensitivity of the information he sold to Israel." On March 4, 1987, Jonathan Pollard stood in court and gave a statement before sentencing. "I broke trust, ruin, and brought disgrace to my family. I must admit wholly and unequivocally my criminal culpability before the court. In spite of the fact that I neither intended nor wanted to take monetary compensation for my actions on behalf of the Israelis, I did. When I am alone, I can rationalize in my moments of desperation the possible good that might come of it, but it is cold comfort, because we are, I guess, at the bottom, Your Honor, a nation of laws." Then, in a stunning move, Judge Aubrey Robinson rejected the prosecution's sentencing recommendation. "I have never had more voluminous submissions in connection with the sentencing of a defendant than I have had in this case. I pronounce sentence as follows. With respect to the defendant Jonathan J. Pollard, I commit the defendant to the custody of the Attorney General or his authorized representative for his life." Olive describes Pollard's reaction. His face paled and he seemed dazed and confused, like a beaten man with no energy left to respond. Behind bars, his marriage didn't survive. He divorced Anne after her release on parole in 1990, following 5 years in prison for collaborating with her husband. While serving his life sentence, Pollard gave an interview to CBS's 60 Minutes explaining his motivation for spying.
There is no excuse
For what you did?
for the breaking of a law. Never. There is an explanation, however. Not an excuse, but an explanation.
And that explanation is?
I can give you a number of soft reasons why I was motivated to do what I did.
Soft reasons?
Soft reasons, having to do with a family that was destroyed in the Holocaust, having to do with the realization that this government in the 40s had abandoned the Jewish people to its fate in Europe. The hard reason why I did what I did was because I had become aware of Mr. Weinberger's agenda in Washington with regard to Israel.
Which was to abandon Israel? Is that the point that you're making?
It was fundamentally to place Israel in a position where she would be forced to make an unenviable choice between a ruinous war or shameful peace.
Jonathan's father, Dr. Morris Pollard, a renowned microbiologist who spent much of his career at the University of Notre Dame, spent the last decades of his life fighting for his son's release. He died in 2011, burdened by the bitter regret that he would never see his son walk free. 4 years later, in 2015, Jonathan Pollard was released from prison after serving 30 years. He moved to Israel in December 2020 after his parole expired and all restrictions were lifted.
In emotional arrival, new immigrants to Israel, aka Olim, Jonathan Pollard and his wife Esther, kissing the Israeli ground upon touchdown.
Though Prime Minister Netanyahu was there to greet them at Ben Gurion Airport, the arrival was deliberately kept low-key to avoid provoking the United States, where Pollard is regarded as one of its most notorious traitors. Israel had initially framed Pollard's espionage as part of a rogue operation not officially sanctioned by the government. It wasn't until 1998 that Israel formally admitted that Pollard had been its agent. The U.S. had indicted Israeli Air Force Colonel Aviam Sela, but Israel refused to extradite him without immunity. Decades later, President Trump pardoned him on the final day of his first term, just hours before leaving office. Stories like this are a reminder that decisions have lasting consequences. And sometimes we need outside perspective to help us make the right choices. And that's why I'm excited to partner with today's sponsor, Strawberry.me. Strawberry.me connects you with a certified career coach to help you set clear goals, stay accountable, and actually get results. Whether you're stuck in a rut, aiming for a promotion, or thinking of switching careers. I recently had my first session with my coach, Bill, and it was a game changer. I opened up about how I've been struggling with micromanaging and finding it hard to fully delegate to my small team at Newsthink. One of the things Bill asked me was, does my team know they're good, that I trust them? And that really stuck with me because I never thought of it like that before. Even after just one session, I felt much better about being a better manager. We've now scheduled weekly sessions and I really look forward to them. The most important project you'll ever work on is you. So don't wait. Head to strawberry.me/newsthink to get matched with your own certified coach by taking a quick quiz. And use my code Newsthink for a $50 credit and start transforming your career today. Thanks for watching. For Newsthink, I'm Cindy Pom.